It's Portugal. It's Uruguay. It's South Korea. And it's Ghana. It's Group H. And it's the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar. It's the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. Where we begin with the summary and form of each team, just as kind of a warm-up, and leads us into a discussion of their prospects, their ELO rankings and FIFA rankings, their odds and their head-to-head histories, and then we're going to talk about it a bit and see what we think. So let's begin with a summary of Portugal, and a recent summary kind of talking about their form. So, right, Portugal, in summary, they had three good periods. 1966 was a spike, though only in World Cup play. The second was around 1985, where they reached both World and Euro Cups. And their third period is much longer, extending from 1996 in Euro Cup play and 2002 in World Cup play, but which has continued until the present day, led by a strong team captained by Luis Figo in the early period and Cristiano Ronaldo in the latter part. Euro Cup play has been more consistent than World Cup play, with some lapses in their World Cup history, but greater consistency in the Euro Cup. They've reached impressive peaks in both, with third and fourth place finishes in the World Cup, but first and second place finishes in the Euro, as well as three semi-final finishes, most of them in recent times. Despite all those plaudits, though, their regular second place finishes in qualifying, often reaching cups through a playoff, is a bit disconcerting. We could say the same about the third place finishes in the last two Euro Cup groups, actually. Given how weak a team they were in the previous century, there's a looming fear that they will not so much return to that, but fall from the strength that recent generations have blessed them with.
Portugal's Euro Cup strength, longer and more consistent, has yielded better results, and it is too soon to say that a round of 16 finishes in 2020 is a sign of decline. However, second place qualification behind second-tier team Ukraine and Serbia are the type of results that make them seem less than a top team, despite some top-level tournament finishes. Even getting to this cup, as we saw, was by pretty narrow margins. The 2022-23 Nations Cup League A results gives a similar impression. With Ronaldo reaching retirement soon, there is question as to whether they will maintain that form, although they did address that same problem well when the previous golden generation retired.
All right, that is Portugal in a nutshell. And now we'll give you the same kind of nutshell for Uruguay. So Uruguay has had amazing success, especially taking into account how small the country is. With just 3.5 million people currently, they have a record that's the envy of most big countries. They have 2 World Cup titles and 3 fourth-place finishes besides, and they have 15 Copa America titles, as many as Argentina and more than Brazil. Though it was stronger in the early years, they had 2 World Cup titles coming in 1930 and 1950. Also impressive is the duration of their strength. They have had low periods, but never missed more than 2 World Cups in a row, and always seem to return with a team capable of passing the World Cup group stage or winning a regional title. 3 times they've come out of a lull to pass 2 or more World Cup group stages in a row. That's in the late 60s, in the late 80s, and then from 2010. That recent strong period is ongoing, but it peaked with a 4th place finish in the 2010 World Cup and a Copa America title in 2011. It's the fruit of a strong generation that's now aging, though, the question being whether they will face another lull or can renew it quickly enough to remain competitive near the top.
The recent strong period saw a cohesive team under manager Oscar Tabarez, with a memorable cast featuring Diego Forlan, Edinson Cavani, and the jewel or snake, depending on one's perspective, Luis Suarez. That generation is aging out, with Forlan long since retired and Cavani and Suarez both 35. Perhaps more significantly, manager Oscar Tabarez, who led the team for 15 years, gave up the post in 2021. Results have nevertheless remained good, with some good younger talent coming to infuse the team. A quarterfinal finish in 2018 kept that strong period going, even though there were worries of their aging even then. But quarterfinal finishes in the two most recent Copa Americas are ambivalent and leave one waiting to see if they can extend the successful period.
All right, moving on to South Korea. South Korea's World Cup in 1954 was a disaster in terms of results, but it put them on the map as the most senior of Asian teams. If that is arguable, winning the first two Asian Cups and their consistent qualification for the World Cup since 1986 bolster their claim. For the first three of these, the Asian region was afforded only 2 spots, and it was South Korea plus a different team every time. Their fourth place finish in 2002 is by far the best result of any Asian team in the World Cup. Though none can match that, other teams have caught up. South Korea has not won an Asian Cup since 1960, and Japan seems to have surpassed them in recent times.
At the global level, South Korea are doing as well as can be expected. The Asian region is comparatively weak, but passing the group stage at the World Cup in 2010 and beating Germany in 2018 earns them some reputation. However, Japan did pass the group stage and have won the Asian Cup, and Iran beat them in World Cup qualification once again in 2022. Saudi Arabia is returning to form, and Qatar has emerged as a threat. South Korea is long overdue for another Asian title, and not winning one since 1960 is a stain on their record. They need a title there or another World Cup where they pass the group stage in order to stay at or near the top. It's a bit hard to put a finger on Korea's form. Beating Germany in 2018 was a big feather, but they failed to pass the group stage. They can't be blamed too much for losing to juggernaut Qatar in the quarterfinals of the 2019 Asian Cup, but it is a result they need to recover from. Neither is evidence enough to support a dip in form, but nor is there evidence to support a claim to form.
Yeah, and I would say the issue of their difficulty of scoring goals came up when we were doing the podcast, so kind of add that to their recent form as well. Okay, finally, Ghana. In summary, their most outstanding feature is the disparity between their World Cup performances and African Cup play. They seemed almost feeble in World Cup play until 2006, but in fact had won 4 African Cup titles between 1963 and 1982, suffering a lull after that, but resurging in the early 90s. 2006 to 10 was their strong period in the World Cup, but they were unremarkable then in the African Cup. But just as their World Cup success was winding down in 2014, they looked a top team in African Cup play, finishing in the top 4 6 times in a row between 2008 and 2017.
Ghana's strong period ended in 2017. 2018 saw them fail to reach the World Cup for the first time since 2002, and 2019 ended their run of top 4 finishes at the African Cup as they reached only the round of 16. Worse still, they failed to even pass their group stage in 2021. However, successfully reaching the World Cup in 2022 shortly after kind of leaves their current form in limbo too.
All right. So in summary of the summaries, it kind of seems like all 4 teams are in a bit of a limbo. Do you think so?
Yeah, I think there's question marks for all of them. Yeah, I agree. I think it makes it an interesting group. We've seen some impressive rises in form, but also some dips in form. And then, looking at some players aging out, notably Ronaldo and Suarez, those have kind of been the leading lights for their team. So, yeah, I think you put it well when you said that, yeah, it's kind of hard to put a finger on kind of all of them.
Yeah, Oh, well, we shouldn't jump into the discussion quite yet because we have to look at the rankings. Take us through that, won't you?
Yeah, so the pot one team, Portugal, is currently ninth in FIFA and seventh in the ELO rankings. They've been top 10 in both of those rankings really since 2016 when they won that European Championship.
Yeah, and honestly, really, since the golden generation from around 1996, to be honest, I mean, they dipped below 10th only around 2008, but otherwise have pretty much been in the top 10.
Yeah, Uruguay, the pot two team, they're 13th in FIFA and 12th in ELO. So that's really just a few points back of Portugal. They've kind of been in that mark, definitely a top 20 team for a very long time, sometimes popping up into the top 10, but usually not staying there for any length of time.
Yeah, you put it well. I think they're definitely a team to be reckoned with, but a bit hot and cold at the same time. Okay, how about South Korea?
South Korea is 28th in FIFA and 26th in ELO, so again, fairly good agreement between the two systems. That hasn't always been the case, though. In December 2017, they were 59th in FIFA, but 25th in ELO. Their ELO ranking has fluctuated less, where they're kind of a top 30 team. FIFA tends to rank them a little bit lower, but sees a bit more movement up and down.
Yeah, I mean, recently kind of higher than in the past. We saw that they were a weak team before 2002. And, around 2006, they were around 50th. So have kind of risen up. But as you say, they're around 2014. They were quite a bit lower.
All right. And then Ghana, as a pot four team, they're currently 60th in FIFA, which, as I said, is the lowest ranked country among all 32 teams. And they're even lower, 74th in ELO. Obviously, their poor African Cups recently have seen them fall from where they were. Kind of in their glory days in 2010, they were 16th in FIFA and 26th in ELO. And they've, in a way, almost steadily fallen ever since, down to, again, 60th and 74th, which is kind of a historical low despite reaching this World Cup.
Yeah, I mean, it may be a bit harsh in the, as we saw that for 6 African Cups in a row, they were in the top 4. So putting them in the 30s or 40s may be a bit harsh. But honestly, like since then, they really kind of deserve this ranking. I mean, apart from reaching this World Cup, which we saw was a bit of a surprise, getting knocked out at the last at the group stage of the last African Cup, kind of hardly makes them worthy of being here.
They did well to get here, but it was very narrow. As we saw, they only topped their group against South Africa on goals scored and then relied on away goals to get past Nigeria. So they're here, but it hasn't been convincing, though. I will say beating Nigeria is still impressive, though, even if they didn't win one of those games.
Yeah, I mean, but they were a really exciting team and a good team to have at the World Cup in 2006 and 2010. So, I mean, if they can kind of recover a bit of that form, they could be an exciting team here.
Yeah, and we talked about aging stars with Portugal and Uruguay, and we should mention the Ayew brothers, who've been very prominent for Ghana. They're kind of aging out too, so Ghana also in need of some renewal.
I mean, I should say for all of those players we've mentioned, the Ayew brothers and the Suarez and Cavani and Ronaldo too, like the teams are still fairly reliant on those guys to get their goals. And in fairness, they still are producing. Do you worry that they will kind of stop producing in this cup, or do you think they've got one more good cup in them?
It's tough to see. I think it's the last hurrah for many of these players that we've mentioned. So, it's difficult to say. I mean, these players are still, for the most part, playing at good clubs. They're still good players. But yeah, I think it's important that these teams start finding some replacements, and whether they can or not is kind of a big question that they have to answer.
It is. It is tough to say, but it actually may come down to that issue as to whether their team does well or poorly.
Yeah.
Okay, again, we're jumping the gun a little bit there because we're supposed to look at head-to-head records, but that's kind of relevant for what we're saying because some of these teams have played each other recently. Do you want to take us through the overview, Connor?
Yeah, so Portugal versus Ghana, they have met once. That was a win for Portugal.
That is right. That was in the 2014 World Cup group stage. So Portugal having a slight edge there. Ghana was kind of on a bit of a downturn at that time.
Yeah, Uruguay and Portugal have actually only met once, and that was recently. That was the 2018 World Cup round of 16. So that game was won by Uruguay, so they have the one win from one game in that record against Portugal.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that they were close in the rankings with Portugal kind of having the upper edge, but it shouldn't be overlooked that Uruguay knocked them out of the last World Cup.
For sure. Uruguay versus South Korea, it's 2 wins out of 2 for the South Americans.
Right, the last meeting was in 2010 in the round of 16, and Uruguay won that, and their meeting in 1990, which is less relevant.
Uruguay versus Ghana, well, they've met once, and what a famous game that was. That was in 2010, and as we know, Uruguay won that game in penalties.
Yeah, in the histories version of the podcast, we talked about that game where Ghana was on the verge of winning, and Uruguay handled on the line and somehow pulled off the win. So a bit of a grudge match here, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. This will be kind of their first chance at revenge.
Yeah, and a lot of the same players actually still playing.
And then South Korea versus Portugal, they've met once. That was in the 2002 World Cup. And how did that game go?
Well, that was the third group stage game, and South Korea beat Portugal in that one. So that actually, a lot of Southern European teams were pretty annoyed with South Korea in that tournament, and Portugal, not as much as Spain and Italy, but I don't think Portugal have a lot of great will towards South Korea. I'm sure they would like to beat them in this tournament.
Yeah, they met in the third group stage game there in 2002, and they'll meet in the third group stage game here.
Right. Could be important too, yeah.
Yeah, and then South Korea and Ghana, they've never met, so there is no history there.
Right. Okay, well, it's kind of interesting that those teams have met over the years. And now we're going to move on to odds. So the way we've done odds is basically we're not encouraging betting here. We just want to see what the what the professionals kind of think. So we took the odds from 5 betting companies, and we picked the 3 that were kind of most divergent, and basically came up with this number. And the number describes their percentage chances of advancing to the group stage. Advancing to the finals. So of finishing first or second.
That's right. So Portugal are given an 85.9% likelihood of advancing out of the group, which is lower than some pot 1 teams, but kind of to be expected given they're kind of just at the bottom of the pot 1 rankings. Uruguay have a 66% likelihood of advancing. South Korea are behind at 30.0%, and Ghana just behind them at 29.8%. So Portugal and Uruguay the most favored by the odds makers.
All right, and maybe we should begin the discussion there based on whether you agree with those odds or not. What do you think?
For me, this is a difficult group to call, and we talk a lot about the history, and of course, Uruguay, out of all these teams, has the most illustrious history. But we're seeing kind of all these teams in a bit of transition. Transitioning, maybe not transitioning out of good periods, but they're coming off good periods, and there are legitimate questions as to whether or not that will continue. So I find this group, among all of them, a little bit more difficult to predict because, will Portugal and Uruguay and led by their great players have one last great tournament, or has that kind of ship sailed a little bit
And if
I
it
think it
has,
means
if it had sailed, South Korea and Ghana are good enough to take advantage of it, right?
I think so. They put South Korea and Ghana as neck and neck. I think South Korea come into this with a bit more optimism than Ghana. I mean, Ghana's form has been poor recently. Kind of remains to be seen if that's just a blip. But I think coming into this, I would give Korea better odds than Ghana, even though the odds makers put them at virtually identical.
Yeah, me too. Let's begin with Portugal, or I'll kind of say my piece on Portugal. I agree with a lot of what you said. I think this group is the hardest group to read in terms of predictions, and it could kind of turn out anyway. Again, hinging on whether those good players will perform as well as they have for their clubs. I think Portugal kind of has more strength behind Ronaldo, so could make up for it if he doesn't turn in a great performance. Whereas Uruguay is a bit of a black box to me. I know a few of their players, but I don't really know how good they are because they've always been overshadowed by Suarez and Cavani. But I do think, I think 86% is too high for Portugal because I think there is the possibility of a lapse. I mean, we saw they finished third in their last two Euro Cup groups. You know, they generally finish second in qualifying. So I think giving them an 86% chance of advancing here is too high. Do you have
Yeah,
anything more on Portugal?
I think you make good points. Even when they won Euro 2016, they finished third in their group and kind of got through as having one of the better third place records. But I think it also showed the good side of Portugal in that they won that final with basically without Ronaldo playing in that game.
Good
And I
point.
think you made a good point. I mean, Ronaldo is the leader. He's the all-time record goal scorer in men's international soccer. He is a player they look to. But Portugal has, I think, the deepest team in this group. They have good players playing, for top clubs, Manchester City, Liverpool. They have a lot clubs across Europe in, Real Madrid and some of the Portuguese teams that do well in European competition. So I think Portugal have a good team, and I think they can kind of get by without their superstar better than most of the other teams. So I would favor them to win the group. But I think, probably, that 80 to 85% chance, probably about right. I would see them going through 4 out of 5 times, but leaving the possibility that perhaps 1 out of 5 times they would dip below.
The only one I really agree with here is Uruguay, because if we say that's 2 out of 3 times they would pass this group, I think that's right. I really worry about Uruguay kind of coming to the end of an era, and whereas Portugal kind of had a weak period or just were generally weak in the last millennium and generally strong in this millennium, Uruguay kind of undulates a bit more up and down, and losing the players they're losing, I kind of feel that they might be moving into a weak period.
I can't help but feel the same, and I think partly, they produce a lot of good footballers, but as a small country, they just, in some ways, lack the population to reproduce these players, and you see that with smaller countries. You see it with Wales, and I think throughout history, historically Portugal, but Hungary and Belgium and Netherlands. These teams aren't kind of as strong consistently as the bigger countries.
Yeah.
In South America, it would be Brazil and Argentina, which are kind of always there. As a smaller country, I think Uruguay is prone to those fluctuations. They're prone to, perhaps being led by some producing great players. They're strong. Finishing third in South America is in qualification is quite good. But I agree with you. I think they perhaps are coming to the end of a good period, led by some very charismatic players. And whether they can renew that, I'm not sure. That the signs now are that they will be weaker than they were in the past. I would expect them to get out of this group. But certainly perhaps prone to an upset, depending on how perhaps this generation does in their final.
Yeah, I would too, 2 out of 3 times. So I kind of agree with the odds. I think a bigger loss than if Suarez and Cavani don't show up, I think a bigger loss maybe Oscar Tabarez missing. He's been the manager for 15 years, led them through a really good period, and I mean, they're a team like in kind of Wales and Canada. I put them in the same boat, whereas they're a team that is kind of small, very tight, play as good as a team, or probably better than the sum of their parts. But with Oscar Tabarez gone, I wonder if that may be gone too.
Yeah, I think that's a question mark, and this tournament could really kind of show what direction Uruguay are going in future years.
Yeah. All right, I myself see, and I think you agree, I see South Korea as a bit higher than 30%. I would put them, kind of close to Uruguay, so maybe 45%, because I think there's not so much because South Korea is strong. I mean, they're fairly consistent, but just I think those cracks for Portugal and Uruguay may be something that South Korea can take advantage of. Son Heung-min is not aging, so I don't think he's a worry. He's as much a worry as aging out as some of the players we've talked about.
Yeah, and South Korea, they're seeing, I think, they've always had a couple players playing on top clubs. I think some of their players getting a bit more exposure and are getting kind of some bigger moves, which is a good sign. And I think, yeah, South Korea, they showed at the last World Cup that they could take advantage of kind of a faltering European powerhouse in Germany, and I think they could do that again here. I see it more likely than Ghana. I certainly expect South Korea to get points, probably off one of Portugal or Uruguay, maybe both. And yeah, I kind of see them, possibly 4 points from this group. Is that enough to get through? Maybe not. 4 points is kind of right on the fence, but in terms of Ghana, we watched them in the most recent African Cup. They really were poor. They also have some good players playing on top clubs. But I think for Ghana, they need a quick turnaround right before this World Cup, and I just don't see that as happening. Whereas you said, Korea are kind of consistently good, even if they haven't quite asserted themselves in Asia as they might have liked to.
Yeah, I think one of the big concerns for South Korea is where they're going to get goals from, and it's really too bad. We've been watching the Premier League, and Son Heung-min seems in a bit of a dry spell right now. I was looking as we were talking on the internet for the Korean who played for Wolves, Hwang Hee-chan.
Mm-hmm.
And I was all excited because he was a midfielder kind of being used as a forward. And I'm like, if he could get a bit of practice, scoring goals and they got a bunch of forwards. So he's not basically on the starting lineup anymore. And in that search, I actually found Hwang Ui-jo. And do you know him? Because I saw that he was with Nottingham Forest.
Yeah, that was, I think, a very recent signing.
Yeah. So I'm kind of hoping, I'm kind of looking at these players thinking, can they get goals from these guys?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, from what we know of club play, they're all a bit dry. I see that Hwang Ui-jo got 29 goals in 94 games. So that's a very good record with Bordeaux in France over the last 3 years.
Yeah.
But I, in qualifying and especially in cups, what was the cup we looked at? 2019 Asian Cup, where their biggest problem just seemed to be getting goals.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, because I droned on a bit. But Ghana is the other one I disagree with. I would say they're about half as likely as South Korea. And we've talked about a lot of the reasons for that.
Yeah, they've also sacked their manager after their poor African Cup showing. So it's almost like they're trying to rebuild and change things right before the World Cup. And I just don't know they'll have the time to do that. They might surprise, but, and they're capable of it. This is why this is a difficult group to predict. But I just see South Korea as more likely.
Yeah, honestly, you hit the nail on the head there for me. I think the biggest element, the biggest tool in their box is an ability to surprise. And we saw they surprised Nigeria in the playoff that they were expected to use, but really just scraped through. It wasn't a huge surprise. What did surprise me there with Ghana was that they were fielding players who had never, who had no caps for the team. So, I mean, fielding players in an important game like that with no caps for the team, they still seem to be madly scrambling to find a forward for the team, and they've tried out a lot of players, and a lot of players have kind of come and gone. I'm talking very recently, where they come in for 5 games and play, and then they're kind of dropped, and somebody else comes in, a bit like USA with their forwards, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a bad kind of state of mind to be going into a cup with. And if you say they've replaced their manager too, all of those things kind of are negatives for me.
Yeah.
All right. Well, do you have anything more to say, or should we move on to look at the World Cup schedule?
Yeah, we can talk about their schedule, see if there's anything else that comes out of that.
Yeah, I just want to add actually that having said all we've said, all 4 of these teams have fireworks surrounding some of their cups, you know, so it could be quite an exciting group. And maybe the fact that we're not, we're not kind of confident in our predictions will be part of the fun. But hey, I forgot to pin you down here, so let's do the World Cup schedule, and then I'm gonna pin you down to an answer.
Sure.
The schedule. Any observations there?
You know what? I mean, in some groups, we've talked about a pot 1 team possibly resting players for a final game. I don't see Portugal necessarily being in that position. You know, it would be South Korea they play. I think this will be a tight, competitive group. Points will be dropped. Points will be won. So I don't really see any advantage from the schedule. You want to win your first game. Portugal play Ghana. That's kind of the biggest discrepancy in the group. So you'd expect Portugal to get off to a winning start there. But
yeah,
I think this will be a competitive group. I think it's hard to predict, and I think it's going to be exciting because teams are capable. Teams have question marks around them. Form is kind of tough to read, but I'm very excited for this group.
Yeah, me too. It could be a bit like that. It could be a bit like that 2014 group that Uruguay was in, where Costa Rica kind of came out of nowhere to win it. You know, like it could be just very much go against expectations. And in fact, the last 2 games could be like 2 of the most exciting 3rd round games, or one of the most exciting groups in the 3rd round, because as you say, I think there'll be points shared, so that these 2 games will be very important.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Connor, I have heard you dodge. I've heard you duck. And now I need an answer. How is this group going to turn out?
On the strength of their squad overall, I put Portugal in first place. I'm going to say Uruguay for second. I'm going to go with the rankings in the pot orders. I'm going to say South Korea third and Ghana fourth.
That's funny because that's exactly, excuse me, hang on. That's exactly what I decided for this group. I'm going to go with the rankings, but I think this group has the most potential to not go according to the rankings. So I think it's a pretty fluid guess, and I wouldn't be surprised really at anything that happened in this group.
Yeah.
Either lapses from the top 2, or stronger performances than expected from the bottom 2. All right. Well, anything to add, or should we sign off?
Yeah, I think this is a good point to sign off. Those who are unfamiliar with our media casts might want to keep listening for some information for further listening. But if you're turning off now, goodbye, and we hope to see you next time.
Right, so stay tuned if you want to get a bit more information. Otherwise, we will see you in our player podcasts we're doing one for each of the team and going through their players. All the best.
Bye.
Bye. Okay, further listening. We've done 9 different series of podcasts if you're interested in a deeper dive. Some of the information may be dated, but some of the histories focus on different aspects of the team histories, so it can help you to get to know teams more intimately.
Yes, as mentioned, this is our 10th series, and we have done at least one series on every region except Oceania. We have files for that region too, and we'll do one down the road so as not to leave them out. But let's go region by region.
Right, so Europe, our first series was a group-by-group podcast on the teams of Euro 2020. That was played in the summer of 2021. And for South America, we also did a group-by-group podcast on the teams in Copa America 2021.
For North America, we have done 3 series on CONCACAF. The first was a group-by-group podcast on the teams in the 2021 Gold Cup. That included a look at Qatar. The second was a preview of the 8 teams in the final round of World Cup CONCACAF qualifying. That came with our first player series, where we went team by team through the players. The third was an update halfway through that qualification.
Yes, and for Asia, we did a group-by-group podcast on the 12 teams in the final round of World Cup qualifying, and that included a deep dive into each team's World Cup qualifying history.
We have done 3 series on African teams. The first was a group-by-group podcast on the 24 teams in the 2021 African Cup, played in early 2022. The second, done around the same time, was a team-by-team series on the players for each of those teams. Third and finally, we have recently concluded a series on almost all teams in Africa, a group-by-group examination of the 12 qualifying groups for the 2023 African Cup. This included a deep dive into their African Cup history, which is quite extensive. This provides a look into some of the lesser teams that rarely even qualify for the African Cup.
Right, and we realize that not everyone is interested in the level of detail that we go into. So starting from that series, the 2023 African Cup series, we're editing our media casts into shorter versions. Generally, for groups and teams, this will just be a summary and discussion segments of the longer podcasts. And for the player ones, just the sections on the squad's overall strength and a list of the main players that we expect to reach the competition. So that's usually 2 or 3 groups per episode.
Yes, otherwise each long version of the series contains a deep dive into the matter at hand. So if it's African Cup qualification, for example, it's a deep dive into the team's history of African Cup qualification. Or if it's the World Cup qualification, a deep dive into each team's history in qualifying for the World Cup.
Right, and all of those podcasts can be found in our library at soccerphiles.captivate.fm. That's Soccerphiles with a PH in the middle and an S at the end. And we also provide a link to our website and other relevant material in the show notes for each media cast. And in general, to find us, you can type Soccer Files Canada into Google, and it's easy to find your way from there. Or just check out the show notes for this or any of our media casts, and it'll be easy to navigate from there.
Okay, see you in our future media casts.